The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Rothwell mansion as Elena Vasquez quietly dusted the priceless artifacts in the grand foyer. At 28, she had been working as a housekeeper for the wealthy Rothwell family for 3 years, invisible to most guests who passed through these gilded halls without acknowledging her existence. Her small frame moved efficiently between the antique furniture, her calloused hands gentle with each delicate piece, treating them with more care than she had ever received in her own life. Elena had learned long ago to make herself unnoticed. In a house where million-dollar business deals were discussed over breakfast and charity galas cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, a Mexican immigrant cleaning lady was barely a shadow on the wall. She preferred it that way. Invisibility meant job security, and job security meant she could continue sending money to her ailing mother in Guadalajara. Elena, the sharp voice of Mrs. Margaret Rothwell echoed through the mansion's corridors. The music room needs to be prepared for tonight's gathering. Sí, señora. Elena called back, setting down her duster and gathering her cleaning supplies. The music room was Elena's favorite space in the entire mansion, though she would never admit it to anyone. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the mansion's perfectly manicured gardens, and a magnificent Steinway grand piano dominated the center of the room. The walls were lined with first-edition sheet music, some pieces worth more than Elena's annual salary. As she entered the room, Elena paused to admire the piano. Its ebony surface gleamed like a mirror, and she had spent countless hours polishing every inch of it to perfection. Sometimes, when the family was away, she would sit at the bench and run her fingers silently over the keys, remembering her childhood when her grandmother would sing her to sleep with traditional Mexican folk songs. "Careful with that piano," came a gruff voice from behind her. "It's worth more than you'll make in 10 lifetimes." Elena turned to see James Rothwell Jr., the family's eldest son, standing in the doorway. At 35, he was a successful investment banker who had inherited his father's sharp business acumen and his mother's dismissive attitude toward the help. His expensive suit was impeccably tailored, and his blonde hair was perfectly styled, but his blue eyes held a coldness that Elena had learned to recognize and avoid. "Of course, Senor James," Elena replied quietly, focusing on her cleaning supplies. "Tonight's gathering is important," James continued, walking to the window and gazing out at the gardens. "Father is hosting several potential investors for his new opera house project. Everything needs to be perfect." Elena nodded, having overheard conversations about Harold Rothwell Sr.'s latest philanthropic venture, a $50 million opera house that would bear the family name. The senior Rothwell fancied himself a patron of the arts, though Elena had noticed he rarely attended the performances he funded. "The Milano Opera Company will be performing excerpts tonight," James added. "Some of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. Father wants to impress the investors with the caliber of talent his opera house will attract." As James left the room, Elena began arranging the chairs for the evening's performance. She had seen several of these private concerts over the years, watching from the doorway as elegantly dressed guests sipped champagne and applauded politely at appropriate moments. Most seemed more interested in networking than in the music itself. Later that afternoon, Elena was polishing the silverware in the butler's pantry when she heard voices approaching. Harold Rothwell Sr. was walking through the hallway with a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, both engaged in animated conversation. "The Milano Opera Company is exceptional," the stranger was saying. "Their soprano, Isabella Moretti, has one of the finest voices in Europe. Tonight's program includes Nessun Dorma and several pieces from La Traviata." Elena's breath caught. Nessun Dorma was one of her grandmother's favorite arias. Abuela Maria had been a semi-professional singer in Mexico before marriage and children ended her career, but she never lost her love for opera. She had taught Elena every note of that aria, along with dozens of others, during the long summer evenings of Elena's childhood. "Excellent," replied Harold Rothwell. "I want these investors to understand the level of artistry we're committed to supporting." As their voices faded down the hallway, Elena found herself humming the opening notes of Nessun Dorma under her breath. The melody felt as natural as breathing, each phrase flowing effortlessly from her memory. That evening, Elena watched from the kitchen doorway as guests arrived for the private concert. Women in designer gowns and men in perfectly tailored tuxedos filled the music room, champagne glasses glinting in the chandelier light. The Milano Opera Company had set up near the piano, their costumes and staging equipment transforming the space into a miniature theater. Elena had permission to listen from the service hallway as long as she remained out of sight. As the performance began, she closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. Isabella Moretti's voice soared through the mansion, each note technically perfect but somehow lacking the emotional depth that Elena remembered from her grandmother's singing. When the soprano began, Nessun Dorma, Elena found herself silently mouthing the words along with the performance. But as the aria progressed, she noticed several missed subtleties, places where her grandmother had taught her to add ornaments, moments where the emotion should build more gradually. phrases that needed different breathing patterns to achieve their full impact. The performance concluded to enthusiastic applause, and Elena slipped back into the kitchen to help with the serving of dessert and coffee. As she arranged pastries on silver platters, she could hear Harold Rothwell addressing his guests. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard tonight represents the caliber of artistry that the Rothwell Opera House will bring to our city. We're not just building a venue, we're creating a cultural legacy. Elena carried a tray of coffee cups into the music room, moving as invisibly as possible between the guests. Near the piano, she overheard a conversation between James Rothwell and one of the investors, a silver-haired woman in an emerald gown. The soprano was technically proficient. The woman was saying, but I found her interpretation somewhat ... cold. Opera should move the soul, not just demonstrate vocal acrobatics. Well, finding truly great opera singers is increasingly difficult, James replied dismissively. Most of today's performers are more concerned with technique than emotion. As Elena set down the coffee tray, Harold Rothwell approached the group. At 72, he was still an imposing figure, his silver hair perfectly styled and his bearing radiating the confidence that came from a lifetime of wealth and power. Actually, Harold said, overhearing the conversation, I believe great voices are everywhere, we just don't always recognize them. True talent transcends social boundaries. The woman in emerald smiled politely. That's a lovely sentiment, Harold, but surely you don't believe a truly exceptional opera voice could emerge from just anywhere. Harold's eyes gleamed with mischief. I believe talent is God-given, regardless of circumstances. In fact, I'd wager that somewhere in this very room, there might be a voice that could rival what we heard tonight. The guests laughed, treating his comment as another example of Harold's eccentric theories about meritocracy, but Elena felt her heart skip a beat as Harold's gaze swept the room and momentarily rested on her. You can't be serious, said another guest, a portly man with a thick accent. Opera requires years of training, proper technique, cultural education. It's not something one simply possesses naturally. Perhaps you're right, Harold conceded with a smile. But wouldn't it be fascinating to test that theory? Elena quickly finished serving the coffee and retreated toward the kitchen, but Harold's voice stopped her at the doorway. Ms. Elena, isn't it? Every conversation in the room ceased. Elena felt 20 pairs of wealthy, curious eyes focusing on her as she turned slowly to face her employer. See, Senor Rothwell? She replied quietly. Elena, you've been listening to tonight's performance, haven't you? Elena's cheeks burned with embarrassment. I'm sorry, Senor. I was only no need to apologize, Harold interrupted with a wave of his hand. I'm curious about your opinion. What did you think of Miss Moretti's interpretation of Nessun Dorma? The room fell completely silent. Elena glanced around at the expectant faces, feeling trapped between honesty and the need to keep her job. James Rothwell was frowning disapprovingly, clearly annoyed by his father's impromptu social experiment. It was very beautiful, Senor, Elena finally said, but Harold pressed. Sensing there was more, Elena hesitated, then took a deep breath. But my grandmother always said that Nessun Dorma is not just about perfect notes. It's about hope conquering despair, about the heart crying out in the darkness before dawn. Murmurs rippled through the room. The woman in emerald raised an eyebrow, while several other guests exchanged glances that ranged from amused to skeptical. Interesting, Harold said thoughtfully. Your grandmother was familiar with opera. She sung professionally in Mexico. Senor, she taught me many arias when I was a child. Does she now? Harold's eyes were twinkling with genuine interest. And did she teach you to sing them as well? Elena felt panic rising in her chest. This conversation had gone far beyond anything she was comfortable with. A little, Senor. But, would you sing something for us now? The request hit the room like a thunderbolt. James stepped forward quickly. Father, I don't think this is appropriate. Our guests didn't come here to hear beautiful music. Harold interrupted firmly. And I have a feeling Elena might surprise us all. Elena's mouth went dry. She looked around the room at the faces staring at her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. These people lived in a world of private jets and exclusive clubs, of opera boxes and charity galas that cost more than her family's home. What could she possibly offer them? Y en primera, could enete, Senor. I'm not trained like Elena, Harold said, gently walking closer to her. I'll make you a deal. If you can sing Nessun Dorma with the emotion and interpretation you believe it deserves, I'll donate an additional $1 million to the local children's music education program. But if you prefer not to, there's absolutely no pressure. Elena's breath caught. $1 million for children's music education, more money than she could comprehend. Dedicated to giving other children the gift of music that her grandmother had given her. She thought of Abuela Maria, who had died 3 years ago just before Elena came to work for the Rothwells. She thought of all the summer evenings when her grandmother's voice had filled their small home with beauty and hope. She thought of the children who might never experience that magic without proper funding for music programs. Senor Rothwell, Elena said quietly, I am not dressed properly for such a performance. Harold smiled broadly. My dear, when God gives someone a voice, He doesn't require formal attire to display it. Elena looked around the room one more time. James was shaking his head in disapproval. Mrs. Rothwell looked mortified, and most of the guests appeared to be bracing themselves for an embarrassing amateur performance that would provide gossip material for weeks. But in Harold's eyes, she saw something different, genuine hope and curiosity, as if he truly believed she might have something worthwhile to offer. Elena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and made her decision. Very well, Señor, you will sing. Elena's decision sent a ripple of whispers through the assembled guests. As she walked slowly toward the piano, she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. The elegant women in their designer gowns shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while the men checked their expensive watches, clearly anticipating an awkward performance they would have to endure politely. Isabella Moretti, the professional soprano, who had just performed, remained seated near the piano with an expression of barely concealed disdain. Her perfectly made-up eyes followed Elena's movement with the kind of cold assessment that only came from someone who had spent years climbing the competitive ladder of professional opera. This is ridiculous, Elena heard someone whisper behind. Her Harold's little social experiments have gone too far this time. James Rothwell positioned himself near the door, his face flushed with embarrassment. He caught Elena's eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if urging her to reconsider this madness before she humiliated both herself and his family. But Harold Rothwell stood near the piano with genuine anticipation in his eyes. At 72, he had built a business empire worth billions, but Elena could see that something about this moment excited him more than any corporate acquisition ever had. Take your time, my dear, Harold said softly as Elena approached the piano. Remember, it's not about perfection, it's about truth. Elena nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned herself beside the magnificent Steinway. She had sung Nessun Dorma countless times in her small apartment, but never in front of an audience, and certainly never in front of people whose world was so far removed from her own. She closed her eyes and tried to transport herself back to her grandmother's small kitchen in Guadalajara, where the aroma of masa and the sound of Abuela Maria's voice had filled the air with magic. She remembered how her grandmother would always pause before singing, placing her hand over her heart and saying, Mia, the voice comes from here, not from the throat, but from the soul. As Elena began the opening notes of Nessun Dorma, something extraordinary happened. The first few phrases emerged from her throat with a pure crystalline quality that immediately silenced every whisper in the room. Her voice, untrained by conservatory standards but shaped by years of emotional connection to the music, carried a depth of feeling that even seasoned opera professionals rarely achieved. Nessun Dorma, Nessun Dorma, tu pure oprincipessa ... The Italian words flowed from Elena's lips as naturally as her native Spanish. Her grandmother had taught her the meaning of every phrase, the story behind every note, the emotional journey that Caliph takes as he sings of his love and determination to win the princess's heart. As Elena's voice soared through the mansion's music room, something magical began to happen to her audience. The skeptical expressions gradually softened, replaced by looks of wonder and disbelief. The woman in the emerald gown leaned forward in her chair, her mouth slightly open in amazement. Even James Rothwell stopped checking his watch and found himself drawn into the emotional power of Elena's performance. But it was when Elena reached the aria's climactic moment, All'alba Vincero, that the full force of her gift revealed itself. Her voice soared, with such pure emotion, such raw triumph and hope, that several guests felt tears streaming down their faces before they even realized they were crying, sang of victory, of love conquering all obstacles, of dawn breaking after the darkest night. But her interpretation went deeper than the aria's literal meaning. In her voice, the assembled guests heard the story of every person who had ever fought against impossible odds, every dreamer who had refused to surrender their hopes despite overwhelming circumstances. Isabella Moretti sat transfixed, her professional composure completely shattered. As someone who had spent decades perfecting her technique, she recognized immediately that what she was hearing transcended any formal training. Elena's voice possessed a rare quality that no conservatory could teach: the ability to make listeners feel as if their own hearts were breaking and soaring simultaneously. As the final notes of Vince echoed through the room, Elena opened her eyes to complete silence. For a moment that felt like eternity, no one moved or spoke. Then Harold Rothwell began to applaud. His eyes bright with tears, he made no attempt to hide. The applause that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever heard, not the polite, measured clapping that had followed Isabella's technically perfect performance, but a thunderous, emotional response that seemed to come from the deepest part of each person's soul. "My God," whispered the woman in emerald, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "I've attended opera performances at La Scala, at the Metropolitan Opera, at every major venue in the world, and I have never heard anything like that." Harold approached Elena, his own hands shaking slightly as he took hers. "My dear child, where on earth did you learn to sing like that?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandmother said, Snar. She always said that the most beautiful songs come from the deepest pain. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Harold replied. What you just gave us wasn't just a performance, it was a revelation. But as the room erupted in excited conversation, Elena noticed that not everyone was celebrating. Mrs. Margaret Rothwell stood near the doorway with a thunderous expression, clearly appalled that a servant had just upstaged professional entertainers in her home. Several of the male guests were whispering among themselves, their expressions suggesting they were uncomfortable with the implications of what they had just witnessed. James Rothwell approached his father with obvious agitation. "Father, we need to discuss this privately," he said in a low voice. "What's to discuss?" Harold replied loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We've just discovered one of the most remarkable voices I've ever heard. She's our housekeeper," James hissed. "This is completely inappropriate. What will our guests think? What will the board members say when they hear about this?" Elena felt her cheeks burning with humiliation. The magic of the past few minutes began to fade as reality reasserted itself. She was still a Mexican immigrant cleaning lady who had just made a spectacle of herself in front of wealthy strangers. The fact that she could sing didn't change her social position or her circumstances. "Perhaps," said a distinguished gentleman with a British accent, "we should consider the practical implications here. Miss Elena clearly has a remarkable gift, but talent alone doesn't create an opera career. There are matters of training, presentation, social acceptance." "Exactly," chimed in another guest. "The opera world is extremely exclusive for good reasons. It requires not just vocal ability, but cultural sophistication, proper education, social connections." Elena listened to the conversation with grown despair. Even after what had just happened, these people couldn't imagine her as anything other than an entertaining curiosity. To them, she would always be the maid who could sing. Not a true artist deserving of respect, but Isabella Moretti surprised everyone by standing up and walking directly to Elena. The professional soprano's face showed a mixture of professional respect and genuine emotion. "Senorita Elena," Isabella said in accented English, "what you just did, that is not something that can be taught. I have studied for 20 years, performed on stages around the world, but you have something that most of us can only dream of possessing." "Gracias," Senora Elena replied quietly. "But I must ask," Isabella continued, "why are you working as a housekeeper when you have such a gift?" Elena's response came from the depths of her heart. "Because gifts don't pay for my mother's medical bills, Senora. Because dreams don't put food on the table or send money to family who need it. Because people like me, we don't get to choose between survival and art." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence carried a different weight. Elena's words had revealed an uncomfortable truth that many of the guests had never been forced to confront. That extraordinary talent often existed in circumstances that made it impossible to develop or share. Harold Rothwell studied Elena's face for a long moment, his business mind clearly working through possibilities. "Elena, what if circumstances could be changed? What if someone were willing to invest in developing your gift properly?" "Senor Rothwell," Elena replied with quiet dignity, "I am grateful for your kindness, but I cannot accept charity. I work for what I earn." "I'm not talking about charity," Harold said firmly. "I'm talking about opportunity, about giving the world access to a voice it needs to hear." Elena looked around the room, at the faces watching her, some still skeptical, some moved, some clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. She thought of her small apartment, her ailing mother in Mexico, the monthly bills that never seemed to get smaller despite her careful budgeting. But she also thought of her grandmother's voice, filling their small kitchen with beauty, of the joy she felt every time music poured from her heart, of the faces in this room that had been transformed by something she had shared from the deepest part of her soul. "What kind of opportunity, Senora?" Elena asked quietly. Harold's eyes gleamed with the same intensity he brought to his most important business deals, the kind that could change not just your life, but the lives of everyone who hears you sing. As Elena considered his words, she realized that this moment would determine not just her future, but her understanding of what was possible when talent met opportunity, when prejudice confronted truth, and when someone with power chose to use it for something greater than personal gain. The choice before her was more complex than simply accepting or declining help. It was about whether she could find the courage to believe that her dreams might be as valuable as her survival, and whether the world was ready to embrace extraordinary art regardless of its source. In the elegant music room of the Rothwell mansion, surrounded by wealth and privilege she had only observed from the margins, Elena prepared to make the most important decision of her life. 3 months later, Elena stood in the wings of the newly opened Rothwell Opera House, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. The elegant venue, with its red velvet seats and gold-trimmed boxes, was filled to capacity with an audience that included many of the same people who had witnessed her impromptu performance in the Rothwell mansion. The transformation of the past months had been nothing short of miraculous. True to his word, Harold Rothwell had arranged for Elena to receive intensive training with some of the finest vocal coaches in the country. Isabella Moretti, who had become an unexpected mentor and friend, had worked with Elena on technique and stage presence. Language coaches had helped refine her pronunciation and diction, while acting instructors had taught her how to embody the characters she portrayed through song. But perhaps the most significant change had been internal. Elena had learned to see herself not as a maid who could sing, but as an artist who happened to have been working as a maid. The distinction was subtle but profound, affecting everything from her posture to her confidence to her understanding of her own worth. 5 minutes to curtain, Miss Vasquez, announced the stage manager. Using the professional name Elena had chosen to honor her heritage while establishing her new identity. Elena nodded, taking deep breaths and running through her vocal warm-ups. Tonight's performance would feature a carefully curated program of arias from various operas, designed to showcase her range and emotional depth. The evening would culminate with Nessun Dorma, the piece that had started it all. In her dressing room mirror, Elena barely recognized herself. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup was applied by experts, and her gown was a stunning creation of midnight blue silk that had been designed specifically for her. But the most striking change was in her eyes. They held a confidence and self-possession that had been developing gradually over the past months. A soft knock at her dressing room door interrupted her preparation. "Come in," she called. To her surprise, Harold Rothwell entered, carrying a small velvet box. Despite all the time they had spent together over the past months, Elena still felt overwhelmed by his belief in her potential. "Elena, my dear," Harold said warmly, "I wanted to give you something before the performance tonight." He handed her the velvet box, which she opened to reveal a delicate gold necklace with a pendant shaped like a musical note, studded with small diamonds. "This belonged to my late wife, Catherine," Harold explained. "She was a pianist, not a singer, but she understood the power of music to transform lives. I know she would have wanted you to have it." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Senor Rothwell, I cannot accept something so precious." "You can, and you will," Harold said firmly but kindly. "Catherine always said that jewelry should be worn by someone who understands its true value. You've given my family and everyone who has heard you sing a gift far more precious than any necklace." As Harold fastened the necklace around Elena's neck, she felt the weight of his faith in her, but also the weight of responsibility. Tonight's performance wasn't just about her anymore. It represented hope for everyone who had ever been told their dreams were impossible because of their circumstances. Another knock at the door announced the arrival of Elena's mother, Maria Vasquez, who had flown in from Mexico for the performance. At 65, Maria had been battling diabetes and heart problems, but Elena's new circumstances had allowed her to receive proper medical care for the first time in years. "Mia," Maria said in Spanish, embracing her daughter carefully to avoid disturbing her makeup. "Your grandmother would be so proud. I wish she could be here to see this," Elena replied in Spanish. "She is here," Maria said, touching the pendant on Elena's necklace. "Every time you sing, she is here." The stage manager's voice over the intercom announced 2 minutes to curtain. Elena kissed her mother goodbye and made her way to the wings, where Isabella Moretti was waiting with final words of encouragement. "Remember," Isabella said, "technique will carry you through the difficult passages, but emotion will carry the audience. Trust your heart, and your voice will follow." As the curtain rose and Elena stepped into the warm glow of the stage lights, she was greeted by thunderous applause. The audience included not only the wealthy patrons who typically attended opera performances, but also many people from Elena's community: housekeepers, gardeners, restaurant workers, and others who had scraped together money for tickets to support one of their own. Elena began with "O mio babino caro" from Puccini's Chichi, her voice floating through the opera house with crystalline purity. As she moved through her program pieces from Carmen, La Bohème, Maid, Tascashi, could feel the audience being drawn deeper into the emotional journey of each aria. But it was during her performance of Vici d'Orte from Tosca that something extraordinary happened. As Elena sang of a life lived for art and love, of beauty given freely to the world, her voice carried such authentic emotion that many in the audience recognized their own stories reflected in the music. The aria became not just Tosca's lament, but a universal cry of everyone who had ever sacrificed for something greater than themselves. In the front row, James Rothwell sat with tears streaming down his face. Over the past months, he had watched his father's investment in Elena transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The Opera House's community outreach programs, funded by the success of Elena's story, were bringing music, education to underserved communities throughout the city. Margaret Rothwell, who had initially been mortified by the attention Elena's discovery had brought to the family, found herself moved beyond words. She had spent decades attending charity events and supporting the arts as a social obligation. But Elena's performance reminded her why art mattered not as a symbol of cultural sophistication, but as a force capable of touching the human soul. As Elena prepared for her final piece, Nessun Dorma, she looked out at the audience and saw faces representing every level of society. Wealthy patrons sitting next to working-class families, professional musicians sharing the experience with people who were hearing opera for the first time. She thought of her grandmother, who had dreamed of singing on a stage like this but had never had the opportunity. She thought of all the talented people whose gifts remained hidden because circumstances had never allowed them to flourish. She thought of the children in the music education programs who might one day stand on this same stage, because someone had believed their dreams were worth investing in. As the familiar opening notes of Nessun Dorma filled the opera house, Elena's voice soared with all the hope, determination, and triumph that the aria represented. But this time, her interpretation carried additional layers of meaning. The victory wasn't just Caliph's conquest of the princess's heart, but the triumph of every person who had refused to let circumstances define their possibilities. When Elena reached the climactic vincero, "I will win," her voice filled every corner of the opera house with such power and conviction that the audience rose to their feet as one. The sustained ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, with people weeping, cheering, and applauding not just for Elena's extraordinary performance, but for what she represented, proof that talent and dreams could overcome any obstacle. When given the chance to flourish, as Elena took her final bow, she caught sight of Harold Rothwell in the wings, his face radiant with pride and satisfaction. Later, at the reception, he would announce the establishment of the Elena Vasquez Foundation for Emerging Artists, designed to identify and support talented individuals from underserved communities. But in that moment, Elena simply stood on the stage where her grandmother had always dreamed of singing, wearing a necklace that connected her to another woman who had understood the transformative power of music, surrounded by an audience that had been forever changed by witnessing the triumph of the human spirit. The maid who could sing had become Elena Vasquez, acclaimed opera performer, and living proof that extraordinary gifts exist in the most unexpected places, waiting only for someone with the vision and courage to help them bloom. As the curtain fell on Elena's debut performance, it rose on a new understanding of what was possible when society chose to invest in dreams rather than dismiss them. When talent was nurtured regardless of its origin, and when someone with power used it to lift others up rather than maintain barriers. The Millionaire's challenge had been answered not just by Elena's voice, but by the tears of an audience that had been reminded of music's power to unite, inspire, and transform lives across every boundary that society might try to create. In the end, Elena's greatest victory wasn't her success as a performer, but her role in proving that beauty, talent, and dreams belong to everyone. They simply need the right moment, the right opportunity, and the right person willing to believe in their value. The end. Disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.